Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning to our today's event. Ukraine, the path ahead, co-hosted by the Center for European Policy Analysis and the Kyiv School of Economics Institute. Today's event will touch upon the findings of a new joint report by a team of 16 authors from the two institutions, which is named Resilience, Reconstruction, and Recovery, the path ahead for Ukraine. This report was released today. And for further analysis, we encourage you all to visit CEPA's webpage at cepa.org and read the full report. Today, our speakers are Sam Green, Elena Rybakova, Volodymyr Dobovik, and Anna Vlasyuk. Sam Green is the Director for Democratic Resilience and the Center for European Policy Analysis. He's also a professor of Russian politics at King's College London. He lived in Moscow for 13 years, working at the New Economic School and Carnegie Moscow Center. Sam wrote 2 books on modern Russian politics and numerous research and policy papers. Elena Rybakova is a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. She's also a non-resident fellow at Bruegel and holds the esteemed positions of Director of the International Affairs Program and Vice President for Foreign Policy at the Kyiv School of Economics. Previously, she worked at high-level positions at the Institute for International Finance, Deutsche Bank, Amandia Asset Management at Citigroup, where she served as Director and Chief Economist for Russia and CIS, and at the IMF. Volodymyr Dobovik is a non-resident senior fellow with the Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Volodymyr has nearly 30 years of experience as an associate professor at the Department of International Relations and the Director of the Center for International Studies at the Odessa National University. Among his teaching and research interests are U.S. foreign policy, U.S.-Ukraine relations, Black Sea regional security, and foreign policy of Ukraine. Anna Vlasyuk is a research fellow at Kyiv School of Economics. Previously, she was a project manager and legal expert at the Office of National Investment Council of Ukraine. Anna facilitated a dialogue between local businesses, international investments, and Ukrainian government. Anna is a graduate of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, Arbitration Academy, and Executive Leadership Program at the Georgetown University. So now I will turn to Sam with my first questions on the report. So the report states that reconstruction should start today, and this is quite understandable. But without Ukraine's victory, its reconstruction will be very limited and best. Until now, we've seen a rather cautious approach of Western governments to the military support of Ukraine, and we often hear about preventing escalation or even not letting Russia lose. In your view, is there a chance for a shift in strategy of the West towards this war? And if yes, what is needed for this change?
Thank you, Ilona, for the question. It's a great question. It really is a large piece of why we wrote the report. I actually want to start by thanking my colleagues at CEPA and the team at the Kyiv School of Economics for coming together to put together what I think is a fairly unique piece of work. We wanted to draw together both the economics and the finance side of reconstruction and recovery with the politics and security, precisely because of the question that you asked, right? That we thought it was important that policymakers, particularly in Washington and in European capitals, understood that we could not divide this agenda, that we can't think about, the war as one set of challenges and reconstruction and recovery as somehow a structurally separate group of challenges. The way that the war is being fought, the degree to which Ukraine is able to defend itself, the degree to which it's able to keep the lights on, to keep the economy functioning at least at a basic level, to keep Ukrainian citizens at home within the country without having to leave for places of refuge outside the country, if possible, to keep them from being placed within the country, to keep the infrastructure, to keep the trade flowing. All of this affects the price tag for reconstruction and recovery down the road. At the same time, it affects Ukraine's ability to defend itself. And so I think we were frustrated as we were beginning to work on this report. And really, we can see this now in the discussions in Washington and elsewhere, where there is a a divide, right? There are people who think what we really need to be doing is bringing this war somehow to a close through some kind of a negotiated solution, as if that were available, in a way that would allow us to then shift the focus to recovery and reconstruction. We think that's a false debate for all of those reasons.
Thank you. And how, in your view, the strategy can be changed? So, what can be the arguments for the shift in strategy?
Well, the report, again, I think highlights a number of arguments. One is the one I've just tried to outline, right, which is that investment in Ukraine's defense capacity now, right, in preventing Russian bombs and missiles from landing in Kharkiv and other cities, keeping the grain shipments open, keeping the lights on, is also an investment in recovery and reconstruction. That the more damage is done now simply multiplies the price tag going forward, and also deprives Ukraine of the human resources that it will need to recover. So we need sort of analytical and conceptual clarity on that. But we also need political clarity. I think it's important for American policymakers in particular, looking at the leadership in Congress at the moment, to understand that the world is watching. And the way that Ukraine is treated, both during this war and after this war, will in many ways shape the world that the US and the West has to live in going forward, right? A world in which the US falls down in its commitments to Ukraine, that it fails to make good on the promises that it has made, is a world that will have more conflict, that will have less trade, that will have less prosperity, that will have more migration flows. All of the things that the US and other Western governments are struggling to grapple with and to maintain will be multiplied if Ukraine is allowed to fail and if Russia is allowed to succeed. And so one of the arguments that the report makes is that just as the Marshall Plan was fundamentally in American interest at the end of World War II, it is fundamentally in the national security interests of the United States and the European Union to ensure that Ukraine wins this war and that it is supported to rebuild itself after the fighting stops.
Thank you. Also, another thing that the report focuses on is European integration, and in some sense, the war has provided a boost to this integration. Obviously, Ukraine has a lot of homework to do, but the EU probably should also change, and perhaps if EU will need to reconsider its common agricultural policy or the decision-making process within the EU. If the EU is occupied with these reforms, with these changes, will this affect accession of Ukraine and of other countries that are on the accession paths? Will the EU become more inward-looking? What is your view on that?
Well, this war has made the EU more outward-looking than I think it has ever been, certainly since the first Big Bang enlargement, 20 years ago. The reality is that you're right? That the homework for the European Union is at least as significant and in some ways more painful, right, than the homework for Ukraine. The report outlines all of the work that Ukraine is doing and really explains that Ukraine is quite capable of making the changes that it needs to for EU accession. But you did put your finger on the things that Europe will have to do. The structural funds, the common agricultural policy, and decision-making are going to be critical to the ability of the European Union to absorb Ukraine, as well as to absorb Moldova, Georgia, eventually Bosnia, and others. We are, I think, heartened by the degree to which this has reinvigorated those conversations within Europe. It will be a difficult political process, but there are powerful constituencies in the European Union that have been looking for the opportunity to change the way that decision making is made, particularly on foreign policy. We can see that in relations between the Commission and Hungary. We can see that in relations between the Commission and the previous government in Warsaw. We may see that coming down the road with the government in Bratislava. As well as, a need for reform, again, to the economic policies, the cohesion and structural funds, and the common agricultural policy within the EU. Again, not wanting to pretend that any of this is easy, but these are long-standing challenges that the European Union has had. These are challenges that people have been talking about for years. I think the advantage that we have now is because of the recognition of the political imperative and the national security imperative for Europe of bringing Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and Bosnia into the Union. There is at least now the possibility that those conversations move forward and that those reforms take place.
Thank you. This is good news. My next question is to Elena. As the report states, and it's pretty much clear that Ukraine very much needs foreign investment. At the same time, it's hard to imagine why would investors be willing to invest when a missile can destroy their assets. Moreover, Ukraine's standard competitive advantage used to be a cheap and highly educated workforce, and that is obviously also reduced because of the war. So what can be other advantages that would outweigh the risk of investing in Ukraine? And those few companies who already invest in Ukraine during the war, why do they do that? So what would you suggest for other companies to consider?
Thank you so much. I think as we highlight in the report we need to think about the future. The period when accession countries or former accession countries could enjoy just cheap labor and be sort of the cheap production factories is no longer viable. There are other places around the world that might do it better. And it's a lot of those sort of opportunities have been exhausted. So it has to be thinking about Europe in the future, why Europe needs Ukraine in the future. Europe would like to do the transformation. It would like to have green transformation, greener technologies, greener metals and mining, and Ukraine can provide that opportunity. There is some of the rebuilding can be done differently, unfortunately, partially because of the war, but there can be benefit. There can be leapfrogging of the way that the metals and mining is rebuilt in Ukraine with thinking about future integration into Europe. So we can think about that is one aspect. Another aspect is natural resources. Ukraine is very close to Europe. Was everybody talking about the sort of cleaning of the value chain, sort of friendshoring or being nearshoring or sort of having the community of the like-minded countries? Ukraine can provide a lot of resources, whether it's from the energy, metals and mining, whether it's critical minerals, including lithium. And also, unfortunately, the war brought the military tech into the picture. We know that Europe will be spending much more on defense. And Ukraine can provide a lot of the research and development as well as some of the components that can be produced in Ukraine. Of course, as you say, for companies, it is a concern. We need to think about security guarantees and we need to think about insurance. There are some changes already being made, but I think we definitely need to do much more on that front.
Thank you. And also, if Ukraine received this investment or if and when Ukraine receives the support from other governments, it will need much more administrative capacity to absorb this money and to put them to the most effective and efficient use. So what steps should Ukraine do to improve its administrative capacity? And if there are political constraints, how do you see dealing with these political constraints?
Thank you, Ilona. You worked as much as anybody on some of these topics, and you have published widely. So the listeners should also look at our report, but also at Ilona's publications. I think we have to strike a balance. We've all worked on Ukraine together with Ukrainian authorities for many years. We cannot boil the ocean in the middle of the war. So some of the programs that I look, working with Ukraine, saying you have to do EU accession, you have to do the best IMF program, structural reforms, and the list goes on. that cannot possibly happen during the war. One has to prioritize on the critical reforms. And I think some of the sort of traditional public administration reforms are critical. Some of the traditional and something that we've been working for, the authorities in Ukraine have been working for a while on the anti-corruption agencies, anti-corruption reforms are critical. And some of the other reforms will have to come with time. The absorption capacity is an issue. Most likely there will have to be some sort of a unit that will monitor or sort of centralize the incoming flows of the public and private financing. There will likely have to be the unit that will coordinate that. There will have to be training. And that also means that some of the flows will not come as rapidly as we would like them to be. But again, this is part of the issue of the administrative capacity, maybe previous sort of lack of reforms in certain areas, but part of it is just the size of the country, the sheer size of the needed reconstruction needs. Most countries cannot absorb 100% of GDP. So it's not just about Ukraine, it probably would be about any country. But what I want to make a point here is that we are, many of us who used to working on emerging markets or bigger economies, as well as the countries at war, Ukraine is unique in a sense that actually the quality of institutions is much higher than many of the countries that maybe would have worked at countries sort of post-conflict, post-war countries coming out of the military sort of aggression or war. So in a sense that Ukraine will definitely have an advantage here. And also we need to think about bringing people back. As the longer time takes, as Sam said just a second ago, people start to settle in the countries. Maybe they came in temporarily, but their kids start going to school, they get jobs, that's much harder for them to come back. So then we'll also have to create incentives for people to be able to come back, to provide social infrastructure for families, to incentivize them to go back to Ukraine.
Thank you. This is all very good points. And my other question is for Anna Vlasyuk. We obviously see the problems now with the provision of support to Ukraine from United States. There were some repercussions with the support from the European Union. But there is this huge pool of resources which are frozen Russian assets, which everyone has been discussing for 2 years or even more right now. But we see very little progress with this. Could you please tell us what are the legal issues around this confiscation of assets? Why is this so complicated? And is there any hope that Ukraine will eventually receive them?
Thank you, Ilona. So legal issues surrounding this idea is that countries that hold Russian assets within their jurisdiction were not certain whether they have standing to act against Russia in this way. Second, they were concerned whether this measure will comply with rule of law, and also they were worried about the implicated sovereign immunity. And it is important to understand that public international law has affirmative answer to all of these concerns. First of all, states have standing to act against Russia based on the doctrine of countermeasures. And countermeasures is not some unique, novel approach developed specifically for Russia. It is a well-established and widely confirmed principle of public international law. We know that international system is a horizontal system of equal actors, and there is actually no law enforcement mechanism as a matter of public international law. The only quasi-enforcement system or mechanism is UN Security Council, which is unavailable due to Russia's veto. It is also important for us to remember that Russia is abusing its veto, and Russia has been historically using veto powers almost twice as much as any other member of UN Security Council. And obviously Russia is using its deter right now to insulate itself from any legal recourse or any responsibility. The doctrine of countermeasure is articulated in the articles on state responsibility. The rule on countermeasure itself is a customary international law rule, but it is codified in the articles of state responsibility. And it is interesting that when you look at the drafting history of the articles on state responsibility, It was specifically addressed by the legal scholars who work on the text that countermeasures will play even greater role in the situation when the UN Security Council is blocked because of the political deadlock, which is exactly the situation which we have in the present case. Another concern that states might have regarding the countermeasures is whether they can employ countermeasures against Russia as third states or specially affected states. Again, to understand this, we need to understand what are countermeasures under international law and what are sanctions under international law. In fact, many of the sanctions that have been employed against Russia since 2014 are actually third-party countermeasures, because sanctions is not even a term of public international law. We have retortions or countermeasures. Retortions is the unfriendly action against the state, which is yet permissible under international law and legal. Countermeasures is action which would be illegal in any other circumstances under international law, but the wrongfulness is precluded because it is invoked in order to stop the greater violation of international law. And if we carefully analyze many of the measures adopted against Russia, especially trade restrictions, they are in fact countermeasures, because states did not refer to any provision in a WTO regime to justify these measures. These measures were justified purely for the protection of peace and security, and rightfully so. So the states were using countermeasures against Russia already, and they have a full capacity and standing to invoke this specific type of countermeasure by means of confiscating Russian reserves. As to the concerns about the rule of law, again, the rule of law is not about the existence of a particular procedure for every kind of situation that may occur. Rule of law is about having the legal principles that guides the states to adopt the procedures to implement certain actions. So if the states, G7 partners, come together, enter into a binding international treaty that they have to bring Russia to compliance with international law, to induce Russia to stop aggression, to induce Russia to pay Ukraine's reparation, then based on the on this treaty, they will be empowered to amend national legislation and to create special procedures that would allow the confiscation on Russian reserves. And on immunity, it is a widespread misconception, actually, that the sovereign immunity is presumed and that sovereign immunity is somehow attached to the assets. In fact, sovereign immunity is a procedural rule. The legal instruments governing this question are, for instance, for the EU is the UN Convention on Judicial Immunities of States and Their Property. And the key word here is judicial. So the immunity protects the states from being sued in the courts of other states and from enforcement, again, through the judicial procedure. So immunity is not some kind of abstract feature attached to the assets. And as we argue in this paper and in many other publications, that the countermeasures should be implemented through executive action. So in this particular case, the issue of immunity will be avoided altogether. And another thing which we need to touch upon is the rise of all sorts of loan or bond ideas or financial engineering ideas, which should help to go around the issues of confiscating of Russian assets. So first of all, we want to thank all people who think about it, because we understand that they are well-meaning, and people who come in from private markets practice think, let me bring my toolbox and help to resolve this issue. It's just that the relations between Russia and Ukraine and other states exist in the realm of public international law. And these issues have to be addressed within the realm of public international law. And when states are concerned about creating policy precedent that might alienate other countries from holding reserves within the jurisdiction of G7 countries, actually public international law would give these countries more comfort. They would understand that there is only very high level of international consensus that will suffice, that would empower the states to act, rather than states will resort to some financial engineering and legal shenanigans under the legal system, national legal system, to take over these assets. So to finalize the point on political or policy precedent, we hear a lot that G7 countries are concerned how they will be viewed by other nations who are holding the reserves within their jurisdiction. And our response that, first of all, no country should be concerned about being subjected to countermeasures unless they are planning a full-scale invasion in violation of UN Charter. But even if they do, actually, there is enough of unique factual circumstances in this case where we can distinguish this particular case from any other potential wars or incursions on territorial sovereignty of other states. So if the countries will enter, when the countries will enter into this special treaty to authorize the transfer of Russian assets to Ukraine, they will have to cite as a prerequisite certain events, such as Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea for more than 10 years, Russia's incorporation of 5 Ukrainian territorial units into its constitution. So this is something that even China, if it decides to move on Taiwan, will be very difficult for China to replicate. So we can distinguish these situations from any other potential similar acts of aggression. And again, repeating what Sam Green has stated, that it is also about sending signal, and it is we believe that actually this measure will have a positive impact on strengthening peace and security, and potential aggressors will think twice because they will know that business as usual will not be possible anymore.
Thank you. So to summarize your answer, as far as I understand, the G7 countries need to design and sign a treaty that would state that they are willing to restore the international law and punish Russia, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's good to know. And we see that so far they have been reluctant to do that. And probably, I may be wrong, but probably one of the reasons is that some countries want to restore business as usual with Russia. And probably some countries think about their businesses who are still in Russia and earn quite substantial profits there. So how would you suggest to convince the companies that still stay in Russia that those assets there are lost anyway, and there is no way that they're going to stay there and earn their profits?
Thank you. It's a very important point indeed in our discussion with partners. And to be honest with you, I don't understand why companies are still staying in Russia. I have a background in investment arbitration, and I find it really appalling that any responsible CEO continues doing business in Russia. What they should have done, they should have pulled out immediately and initiated investment arbitration against Russia, because the legal measures, regulatory restrictions that have been imposed by Russia are so obviously violating all possible standards of treatments of foreign investors under the bilateral investment treaties, such as prohibition of discrimination, such as frustration of reasonable expectations of investments or investors, or indirect expropriation. So I'm really surprised why the companies are not initiating investment arbitrations like they did in many other cases. For instance, Spain, which is a law-abiding nation, when Spain lowered the feed-in tariff for green generation, it was bombarded by avalanche of investment arbitration claims. For some unknown and inexplicable reason, the investors in Russia are continuing to play victim, and only 2 of them, to my knowledge, have filed preliminary statement of claim against Russia. And as to the Russia's regulations affecting foreign companies, we need to understand that the most severe measures have been adopted during the times when Western governments maintain that confiscation of sovereign assets are completely off the table. First off, in early days of the war, Russia adopted the concept of unfriendly state. It is a legal term in Russia. Unfriendly states include all countries of sanctions coalition, and companies coming from those states or affiliated with them somehow even when there is a minority shareholding, are severely discriminated in Russia. They are not able to transfer any FX payments abroad, including payment of dividends, repayment on loans, or repatriation of investments. But what is interesting, sometimes it even appears that most onerous restrictions were adopted in synchronicity with Western statements that the West will not confiscate Russian reserves. For instance, on May 18, 2022, the US Secretary of Treasury stated that this measure is in contradiction with the US law, and this is definitely something that US will not do. And a week later, Russian Parliament adopted in the first reading the draft law on imposition of outside management in foreign companies, which are somehow again unfriendly to Russia. Then a year later, in April 2023, the EU authorities referred to some internal legal reports stated that confiscation of Russian reserves is completely on the table and it is against the EU law. And literally 7 days later, the famous presidential decree of Putin was issued, which created a legal basis for expropriation of foreign companies. And then 2 months later, based on this specific decree, the several foreign companies were expropriated. Danone, Baltica, Fortum, and Unipro were expropriated based on this specific decree. And in between, there were many other measures, such as, for instance, Russian law gave right to Russian companies to disregard vote of foreign shareholders, or even to withdraw the corporate rights of foreign shareholders altogether, meaning that foreign shareholders would not be counted not just for decision making, but even for calculating the quorum, and they were deprived of any meaningful investment in investor rights.
Thank you. This indeed confirms what we see also in the military and other spheres, that Russia escalates when it sees weakness or when other countries back down. And I think this makes a good bridge to our discussion on security. And I now turn to Volodymyr. Volodymyr, I think you may correct me that Ukraine can obtain more or less robust security guarantees only after it enters NATO. And at the same time, NATO has been stating, or some NATO officials were stating, that NATO will admit Ukraine only after the war. And therefore, Russia has an incentive to lead the war indefinitely. In your view, will the situation change? Can Ukraine obtain some invitation to NATO, for example, while the war lasts? And a related question, what do you expect from the Washington NATO summit?
All right, thank you, Ilona. And let me say right away that it's my great honor and pleasure to be part of the SIPA team, specifically of Democratic Resilience Program, which been part of this major, colossal collective effort. It's 4 of us speaking today of the authors and those who contributed, but it's much broader group of people which actually had something to do with the project. So I encourage everyone who is probably watching us right now to actually read the report, the parts that are of most interest to you, or maybe the entire thing, even though it's pretty long. Depending on what you're interested in. So just not limit yourself to just watching this 1 hour presentation. It's pretty solid, I should say. Might sound immodest a little bit to advertise our own report in such a way, but it is indeed, I think it's a major contribution in the field of looking at challenges that Ukraine is facing. On your question, Ilona, I agree absolutely with you, and you are already hinting at your own attitude and possibility of answers to those questions. I also think that the optimal idea for Ukraine, the option for Ukraine to secure its, to provide its security, to enhance its security, to arrange it in a more durable way would be to become member of NATO. But indeed, as you even say, even it could be more or less robust security guarantee. So even the membership in NATO might not have given Ukraine indeed what it needed, because there was now big discussion in NATO about Chapter 5, what it means, how valid is it, how binding is it. Would there be actually defending of countries that are members of NATO in case they're attacked? And also, some people forget that Chapter 5 is sometimes vague on the purpose. It doesn't mean that if one country is attacked in NATO, then all others rush with their troops to defend them right away, like within like 5 minutes or 1 hour or something from the start of aggression. It's much more complicated than that. So in my numerous conversations with experts, our colleagues in the West within NATO countries, I found out that that's true. What Ukraine needs and what Ukraine wants is more than Chapter 5. You know, some kind of a Chapter 5 on steroids. You know, we need something which is right now, which is massive, which is definitely including boots on the ground, and we can't get it. We understand that now. So this is a problem, and of course, as you say, Ilona, it gives Russia an incentive to lead the war indefinitely. In fact, that's one of the reasons why they waged the war, you know, because they saw some progress in Ukraine getting cozy with NATO and the West and US, and there's been some progress, and they've been seeing Ukraine slipping away, and they thought, okay, maybe if we don't attack now, in 5 to 10 years from now, then Ukraine will be even more prepared militarily and more formidable military power, so it will be a more difficult job for Russia actually to achieve its goals. So that's why they launched the war back in 2014, and that's why they escalated massively back in 2022. And the lesson has always been like this. If you remember this very unfortunate, awkward language of the Bucharest summit in 2008, you know, when Georgia and Ukraine first heard that they will be invited one day to join NATO, it only took a couple months for Russia to attack Georgia, to undermine, among other things, to undermine completely Georgia's perspective to ever get closer to membership. So that's what Putin had in mind, and he might wage this war indefinitely indeed. And one option to get out of this conundrum that Ukraine finds itself in, you know, creative attempt to think out of the box, was this idea that maybe the part of Ukraine which is currently under control of Ukrainian government should be invited into NATO. But this idea, when it was first entertained, immediately was met with criticism in Ukraine, because of course it's a harmful idea. It's almost like giving up on a territory that Ukraine does not control, and it's undermining the territorial integrity of Ukraine and coherence of the country in many ways, and it's giving Russia what it wanted actually to, you know, to see 2 Ukraines, one under Russian control and another is as Ukraine as such. But also, to me, that idea was very weak on feasibility, on actually how you gonna do it, how you're gonna even support and defend the part of Ukraine which is under control of the Ukrainian government, and what about those Russian missiles that are flying now to each and every corner of Ukraine. And by the way, I think they're also doing it, among other things, to discourage anyone in the West to think along these lines, like, okay, don't think about partial membership for Ukraine, because we can get to any part of Ukraine, and then you're part of the conflict, then you're part of the war. So that's, of course, a completely big red line. So we know about the fear of escalation. I don't personally expect any big decisions, significant decisions at the Washington NATO summit. We've learned the hard way not to expect too much. Last time around in Vilnius, some people expected, I didn't, but some people did, and they were really disappointed, including President Zelensky, who tweeted, as we remember, on the way to Vilnius, and that actually caused some friction in the alliance between Ukraine and our friends and allies who support Ukraine. So let's be realistic. If there is some new ideas, creative ideas, we'll hear about them at the Washington summit, and I hope so. Secretary Blinken, among others, has hinted that there might be some road plan for Ukraine and membership going forward, but I don't expect anything concrete, anything that would be saying this are the steps, particular steps, and here is a timeline for Ukraine to get closer to the membership.
Thank you. And in the last few months, Ukraine has signed a few security agreements with some European countries. Do you think Ukraine will get some material help from these agreements either today, immediately, or in the future? What is the significance of these agreements?
Right. I mean, I guess the significance is huge. Short of Ukraine joining NATO and enjoying Chapter 5 and enjoying all the benefits of collective security, collective defense, arrangements, the best thing we can get is what we're getting right now. We're getting the security packages, assistance packages. So, I mean, of course, they are not security guarantees. They're often framed called such a way in Ukraine, but all of our allies and friends and partners who are involved in this process with Ukraine, they actually distance themselves deliberately on purpose, quite consciously, from calling themselves this packages security guarantees, starting from the first one, Prime Minister Sunak, who immediately, when he came back from signing this agreement in Kyiv, he immediately went to the Parliament of Britain, of UK, and he said, these are not security guarantees. These are actually massive security assistance packages, which are very much needed for Ukraine. The focus should be on how strategic they are. So the better idea is, of course, to have something going forward for like 5 years at least, where Ukraine would know how much we'll be receiving and what kind of more concrete features of those agreements, even better, what particular kinds of weapons, for instance, or otherwise assistance, diplomatic or financial, humanitarian, energy, whatever they can provide to Ukraine. The more you mentioned actually in the text, the better for Ukraine. So Ukraine is in some ways is a NATO member already, but minus membership and minus Chapter 5. So we are getting so much assistance. No other country in NATO ever in the history of NATO got that kind of assistance, such a huge scale of assistance. So we need to double down on that. Unfortunately, it's more or less on a bilateral level. It's not really in NATO as an alliance, which is coordinating this process. We understand that we need to talk to particular capitals, and they decide what they can do in a meaningful time frame. So the only thing we need to be doing is to be realistic and appreciative and thankful, and of course work with our allies and talking about them into what we need the most right now. Because our security, it has 3 layers time-wise right now. What we need right now for this moment of the war, what we need maybe in the midterm, for the 2, 3, up to 5 years, and what we need in the longer term, what we indeed need to make Ukraine better prepared for the Russian aggression, which is not going to stop, which is not going to go away. We need to understand that, and everyone in the West seems to understand that now. It's been, what Russia's been doing to Ukraine in the last 2 years has been a major wake-up call to a lot of people. It's still not to the level of the understanding and thinking of the Cold War, the old Cold War. It's not a systemic confrontation with Russia. It's not a systemic containment of Russia, but we're getting there. Some, people in the West actually now understand that Russia is a threat, not just to Ukraine, but to themselves, and helping Ukraine to withstand that terrible pressure by Russia is the first step to securing the entire Euro-Atlantic security space.
Thank you. My next question will be to all the speakers, but I suggest to start with Volodymyr, and maybe other speakers will then add on the part of the questions which they consider to be useful for themselves. So the report said that Ukraine should become more like an Israel, which means greater militarization of both the society of Ukraine, economy of Ukraine, and since the Russian aggression is going to last for quite a prolonged period of time, this is a necessity, and that Ukraine must rely more on itself. And under this militarization of different spheres of life, in your view, to what extent should the economy be militarized? Should it be like the World War II economy, where everything was or pretty much everything was working for the military sector, for military production, or should it be more diversified in the current condition? And also a related question. Under this militarization, it's inevitably that the state will have more power over the economy, over the lives of people, and under these conditions, how do we preserve the democracy and democratic institutions? Or maybe preserving them is not a priority right now. Your take on that?
No, I mean, that's a great question, of course. And I must admit right away, I don't know the exact answer to this question. I mean, it's very much a debatable subject that we can all debate, and everyone has a particular opinion. One thing I don't really like the comparison between Ukraine and Israel for a number of reasons. There are some commonalities, but there are many differences as well. Well, first of all, Israel is under constant threat for a prolonged period of time since the 1940s. Ukraine is under threat for centuries. You know, Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian culture has been under threat for centuries. And we know where the threat was coming from, not just from Russia, but primarily, of course, from Russia. The existential threat primarily coming from Russia for a long period of time. So we know how to live with this threat. That maybe we dropped the ball a little bit 2 years ago when we didn't expect this massive. A lot of us didn't expect this massive aggression of Russia against Ukraine, the escalation to the level that we're seeing in the last 2 years. But no one had any illusions about Russia being a major threat and the only thing which is an existential threat to Ukraine. And also, of course, Israel is vis-a-vis its enemies, it's a different kind of asymmetry. The conflict that Ukraine has with Russia is asymmetric because Russia is stronger. They have the upper hand in many respects. Israel, on the contrary, is probably the strongest country in the region. So actually, if there's any asymmetry, even if you take those enemies of Israel collectively together, they are weaker than Israel. And Israel also enjoyed a very specific and very particular special relationship with the United States in the field of security for a long period of time, as we know. Ukraine didn't have anything like that. So if anything, we had Budapest Memorandum, which was extremely vague and weak, and unfortunately seen by a lot of Ukrainians as something which is actually providing Ukraine with viable security, which was not. So going forward, I think that yes, Ukraine would require a certain amount of militarization of its society, of its life, and that would be a danger to Ukrainian democracy. But the only way forward is to keep both democracy and security and keep this axis between them. That's what makes us stronger. That's what makes us different from Russia. That's what makes us tick better and work better as a civil society, as a country, as a people. And that's what does make us much more appealing to a lot of people around the world who are willing to support Ukraine, among other things, because Ukraine is democracy, fighting against a stronger authoritarian system. So, but there will be challenges. Yeah, like this year, I mean, there will be no elections. And most Ukrainians agree that there should be no elections for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think a few months ago, there was a collective letter signed by a lot of people, civil society, NGOs in Ukraine supporting this notion that Ukraine shouldn't go on with elections this year. But there will be people outside of Ukraine, including, say, in US, including, say, in the Trumpist corner of the Republican Party, who will be using this as an example, in their propaganda assault on Ukraine, as Ukraine sliding away from democratic status and nature of the country. But we're still democracy. I mean, unlike Russia, we still have president who has to deal with parliament, with opposition, with civil society, with media and everything. And so it's not that he's living in the vacuum of political life. And that's why he needs to negotiate and maneuver and balance. And that's what he's doing. I don't think Ukraine would benefit from a strong hand, but there would necessarily be a degree, I think, of some increased militarization going forward and maybe forever.
Thank you, Gunter, Sam, Anna, Elena. Would like to add anything on this issue?
I might briefly come in on that. I do agree with pretty much everything that Volodymyr said, but I would add this, right? Part of the answer to the question that you asked, Ilona, really depends on how the West understands Ukraine's future. Whether the West sees, if the West sees Ukraine's future as a Ukrainian problem, essentially, then Ukraine may not have a choice other than to deeply militarize. I mean, look, the reality is that most Western economies now are going to have to remilitarize to a certain extent, right? We have come up against the limits of defense industrial production, and that's one of the reasons why Western countries have struggled to support Ukraine with artillery and other materiel to the extent needed, although, of course, it's not the only reason. But if the West sees Ukraine's future as part of a collective good, a common good for the West, in other words, understands that the West itself benefits from a secure, prosperous, and recovering Ukraine, then the sorts of multilateral security arrangements that are bound up in institutions like NATO, that are bound up even in institutions like the European Union, mean that the burden of militarization can be spread across the continent and across the transatlantic space, and Ukraine can restore its potential as a efficient, growing, and diversified economy.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just jump in quickly here, is that as of today, we can't really speak about the military part of the economy and non-military part of the economy. It's not that, there is a war somewhere, we maybe had it to an extent after the 2014 invasion, but we no longer have it. The two economies at the moment are highly integrated and they function together and you cannot really rip them apart. It's not that people are consuming somewhere, when the war is going on. No, everybody's sort of engaged, you have private enterprises working to provide the supply chains, whether it's for feeding of the army or other components, there are people developing different sort of military tech. So energy is needed for all of the above. So basically, it's a very integrated economy, so you can't rip it apart. And also when investors are thinking about Ukraine, they also need to think about it in this way. Going forward, I very much agree with what other people have said, Volodymyr and Sam, is that it is about burden sharing. If we decide that Ukraine is on its own defending European sovereignty, then it's probably will be less likely to be successful. We'll have to be much more heavily militarized, and it will also carry much greater human cost, and not just economic cost. If we decide to sort of do the burden sharing, and European Union countries seem to be moving, but albeit slowly, and 2 steps forward, 1 step back in that direction, and it's actually very good for European institutions as well. Ilona, you mentioned earlier some of the things that European Union needed to do anyway, thinking about integrating the countries that are waiting to be admitted to the EU, is just accelerated some of those processes. The agricultural reforms need to happen. Common debt issuance in Europe needs to happen. If we talk about the reserve assets and the role of the euro, well, the common debt market is extremely important for that, right? So some of these things that European institutions need to change, and Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine is forcing them to maybe change faster for the better. So I think that is very important. And otherwise, in terms of the sort of either the scenario where I don't think Ukraine will be fully on its own, I think Europeans will continue to support Ukraine. Ukraine will continue to be prepared for as long as Russia remains an totalitarian or dictatorial regime with imperialistic ambitions. Ukraine will have to be mindful of not just military, but also greater resilience of the economy, that the economy can function maybe where there are sort of protective cupolas around some of the industrial parks or key cities, whether maybe there's doubling down on some of the infrastructure. It has to be mindful for many years to come, unfortunately.
Anna, would you like to add anything?
Thank you. Just to clarify again, to add to what Volodymyr said, that there is a lot of manipulation outside of Ukraine about the need for elections. So as a matter of Ukrainian law, elections during the martial law are unconstitutional. So this is end of the discussion here. And in terms of future of Ukrainian democracy, I think Ukraine have demonstrated that we have immensely powerful civil sector, more powerful than in many European countries, and both times when there was serious threat to Ukrainian democracy, it both came from somehow Russian influence through Yanukovych, former exiled President Yanukovych, and both times Ukrainian civil society took matters into its own hand and reversed the course which would lead to concentration of power and potential authoritarian regime.
Thank you. And since we have only a few minutes left for discussion, I would like to ask everyone to comment a little bit on how to, so to say, prevent Ukraine fatigue, which sometimes appears in the discussions, and to ensure not only prolonged support of Ukraine, but also more faster, perhaps, and more intense support of Ukraine. Maybe this should come from the understanding that Russia should lose the war. What is your stance on it?
Maybe I'll just jump in quickly. I think we over-talk Ukraine fatigue. I think if you look at the statistics of various polls, whether it's in Europe or in the US, Ukraine is still very much in the forefront of many voters' minds, and not in a sense of fatigue. So it's concern, it's maybe questions about what are the best solutions, but it's definitely not fatigue. So I think it's one of the talking points that we should be careful not to pick up, because we don't see evidence of that. When we see evidence of that, then we should be discussing it in that kind of context, right? So, but I understand, Ilona, the way you're sort of provocatively asking this question, because it comes up oftentimes from the journalists. There is so little fatigue about Ukraine, is that in the US, it's one of the cornerstone issues of the upcoming elections. You know, it's a foreign policy issue together with the debate about, unfortunately, about the wall and migration. These are the key issues that are driving the election at the moment. And the question is not even about whether to support Ukraine or not to support Ukraine. And then many Republicans are no longer capable of saying we are sort of against support of Ukraine. As you have seen, sort of Speaker Johnson has been trying to put, it's just a different kind of plan. It's a better, smarter support of Ukraine. So the issue is so important, even in the US at the moment, that even the sort of the more hardcore Republicans that are sort of more pro-Trump, they don't dare say that we don't want to support Ukraine at all. So it's so I think that is the key here. And then on the European front, I think it is more a discussion of the broader defense policy in Europe, European independence. And again, that has to continue no matter almost what happens going forward. Even if by some miracle the war ends tomorrow, I think that process has started. Europeans have the box has been opened. Europeans are thinking, how can we protect ourselves? And Volodymyr talked so well about the sort of the NATO setup. How can it work or not work? And I think there is an understanding in many European capitals that they need somewhat greater defense independence. And it is part of the sovereignty and economic sovereignty to have somewhat greater defense independence. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Volodymyr, very briefly.
Okay, so I think that there will be some fatigue, and there is some fatigue actually. It's understandable. It's not inevitable in many ways. It's a longer war. You know, people are moving on with their cycles, new cycles, with their programs, with their priorities. You know, it's nothing major happening after all. Russia took over Kyiv, as one major success in their war on Ukraine for the last, year and a half, maybe. So unless, hopefully, God forbid, there is a bigger movement of Russian troops deeper into Ukraine, there'll be no sense of urgency, which is contributing to that fatigue. You know, and what can be doing about this fatigue is what we've been doing already, doubling down on it. I mean, to some people, just what Russia is doing is morally reprehensible. So let's focus on that. What they're seeing on the screens of their TV sets. You know, for other people, democracy versus authoritarian dictatorial regime, that's good enough for a lot of countries. You know, look at some countries that are far away from Ukraine, say Japan or South Korea or Australia, New Zealand. You know, part of what they're doing and helping Ukraine is that they just want democracy to strive. They have the underdog, democratic underdog, against this massive militaristic superpower, belligerent one, aggressive one, and they want the Ukraine to win. So, or whatever, or of course, their own interests, they need to be put into play. There is a need to explain to our friends in the West and elsewhere that their interests are in the game. Their skin is in the game. And I think, frankly, and I've been talking about it, that Biden administration dropped the ball on that particular account because they didn't, until recent, talking enough. They didn't talk enough about how U.S. interests are supported by U.S. helping Ukraine. And that was unfortunate. That created some vacuum where you had people in a Trump corner like Taylor Greene and others, you know, moving in and explaining, there is no reason for us to support Ukraine if you're thinking about U.S. National interests. So taking all that together, you know, speaking about war crimes, you know, speaking whatever might catch some people's attention, that's what we need to do, you know, basically double down on what we've been doing for the last 2 years.
Thank you. Anna, please, 1 minute.
Thank you. I think the Ukrainian war is really definitive moment in the history of international law. It is the largest in aggression since the Second World War too, and we can see that all the instruments and safeguards that have been in place in international legal system failed to work. UN Charter, prohibition of aggression, and work, UN Security Council resolution blocked, International Court of Justice. Russia has been ignoring its provisional order for over 2 years. So there are countries in the world who actually rely on international law to protect them. If international law will not be enforced this time, only nuclear states and states with the large militaries will be able to protect themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Sam, would you like to make some final remarks?
Sure, just very briefly. I mean, I would agree with everything that everybody has said. My only, point is, and I would take this opportunity maybe to plug another report that SIPA published, also with Ukrainian colleagues just recently on a strategy of containment. And I think that it's interesting to read these two reports in parallel because they do contextualize the challenge that we are dealing with here. One of the things we wanted to achieve with this report was to make it clear that rebuilding Ukraine, supporting its resilience and its recovery is not just an economic challenge, and it's not just a humanitarian challenge. It is a critical element in what the world is going to look like for the next generation or two. We are facing a much bigger challenge when it comes to the threat posed by Russia and by its allies around the world. We have an opportunity in supporting Ukraine on this front to avoid having to fight a much bigger war down the road, one from which recovery might not be quite so easy. But I would leave it at that. And again, thank you, Ilona. Thank you to all of my colleagues from SIPA and to the Kyiv School of Economics, both for the report itself and for today's conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Please be sure to read the report at the SIPA website.